The style of art in the 17th century Dutch Golden Age reflects many parallels with Caravaggio's naturalistic approach to the Baroque in Italy. But, as we know, most Dutch artists didn't study in Italy, so how was it that the Caravaggesque approach made its way north? For that, we can take a group of Dutch artists known as the Utrecht Caravaggisti. These are some artists who were from Utrecht, which was a Catholic stronghold in the Dutch Republic, and so it was safe for them to travel to Italy, and they did so in the first 2 decades of the century. While there, they were able to see Caravaggio's works. Some of them were even there when Caravaggio was still practicing, and they're able then to return to the north in the 1620s, from which point they spread Caravaggio's style to artists who would never go to Italy. Artists like Frans Hals, Rembrandt van Rijn, and Vermeer are all artists who pick up on trends Utrecht Caravaggisti employ. The Utrecht Caravaggisti were at the height of their popularity in the 1620s, and when we look at their works, we can see how they did bring back Caravaggio's stylistic elements, but how they also put their own interpretation on those elements instead of strictly copying them straight over. When we look at this work by Hendrick Terbrugghen, you can see Terbrugghen was one of those in Italy early enough that he's there and working at the same time as Caravaggio. When we look here at the Calling of St. Matthew, immediately we can see that he is drawn to Caravaggio's use of subject matter and composition. This is Caravaggio's version of the Calling of St. Matthew, done for the Contarelli Chapel. It was one of his most well-known works and was seen as a success by most of his contemporaries. But it's not just the obvious elements of composition and subject matter where Terbrugghen is picking up on Caravaggesque elements. We can see that he's using naturalistic, unidealized figures, and sometimes even using those bohemian types that we associate with Caravaggio. He puts those figures close to the picture plane, just like Caravaggio does. They feel like they are in one continuous space with us as viewers, and that really draws us in and involves us. He not only puts them close to us, but he cuts them off so we only see half length, and that too suggests to our minds that we're very close to the action and to what's happening. He also uses foreshortening, just like Caravaggio does, as another kind of technique to involve the viewer. And though Caravaggio often uses eye contact to kind of heighten that connection even further, he doesn't always, and we can see here that Terbrugghen has chosen not to include that as well. But there are some ways that he has kind of set himself apart from Caravaggio's approach. First of all, there is some tenebrism here, and that's definitely something that they saw in Caravaggio's works. But the Utrecht Caravaggisti on the whole usually kind of reversed that tenebrism. So they'd use like a light background instead of a dark background, and they'd use darker figures against that light background. So here the figure of Christ on the left is very dark, and the background is light. So we still get those tenebristic contrasts of light and dark, but done in a very different way than Caravaggio employed. Going along with that, the Utrecht Caravaggisti often use something that we call repoussoir figures. Again, the figure of Christ on the left is dark and in shadows. He's turned away from us. It feels like we have walked up behind him. That is a repoussoir figure. Very often the Utrecht Caravaggisti pair that repoussoir figure with kind of an opening in the composition, and we feel like there's a spot for us to just walk up and join the group and join into the action. Another way that the Utrecht Caravaggisti often differ from Caravaggio is their use of color and tone. Instead of those really strong earthy colors and kind of warm tonalities, they're very often a part of Caravaggio's work. Many of the Utrecht Caravaggisti use a lighter, brighter silver tonality, and sometimes use lighter and brighter types of colors, and we're definitely seeing that here in the work by Terbrugghen. Another thing that the Utrecht Caravaggisti do that's very kind of different than Caravaggio is they're very often including moralizing kinds of messages in their work, and that's definitely part of the northern tradition. And so they use a lot of genre-like kinds of scenes, or they use even some Catholic types of scenes to send a message to the viewer about being a better person and making good choices. Here we can see that the figure with the glasses is kind of providing a foil to the figures who are paying attention to Christ and paying attention to the calling. Instead, this figure and his glasses, which are symbols for spiritual blindness, continues to ignore the holy figures before him and continue to concentrate on the money on the table before him. At times, the Utrecht Caravaggisti are a little less dramatic and have a little less viewer involvement than Caravaggio, but I would say here that it seems pretty equal. Another member of the Utrecht Caravaggisti, Dirck van Baburen, is also in Italy after Caravaggio's time. But still, he was able to see some of Caravaggio's works firsthand. And that's really clear here in his entombment, done in 1617 to 1619. When we compare that to Caravaggio's entombment from 1603, you can see that his subject matter and his composition were heavily influenced by what Caravaggio did. When we start to look in more detail, however, you can see that there are a lot of things that he's doing here that liken to Caravaggio's style, even though he's not quite as accurate in portraying the faces and the bodies convincingly in space. Like Caravaggio here, he's giving us naturalistic, unidealized figures. They're cut off on the sides. They're close to the picture plane. We have some foreshortening as well coming out into our space. Those are all things that really draw us in as viewers. We've got tenebrism here. We've got drama here, again, drawing us in as viewers. And we're also going to see in this work, I think, a good example of the naturalistic attention to detail and to texture. Caravaggio does definitely do that, but it's not on the same level as those northern artists usually do, and most Utrecht Caravaggisti give this more attention, just like we're seeing here. We got this raking light coming across very much like Caravaggio. It maybe is a little less viewer involving and a little less dramatic than Caravaggio's interpretation of the subject. So you can see that we get kind of a spectrum. Some of these works from the Utrecht Caravaggisti showing a lot of Caravaggesque types of elements. Some of them showing a mix that favors more of their own interpretation. So we get definitely different combinations of the use of Caravaggio's style in with these works. The other most influential artist of the Utrecht Caravaggisti was Gerrit van Honthorst, and we're looking at his work here. He is also in Italy after Caravaggio is already dead. So he's definitely seeing Caravaggio's works, but he's also picking up on an influence by some of the followers of Caravaggio, the Italian Caravaggisti, especially like Manfredi. So he's never quite as impactful, he's never quite as dramatic as Caravaggio, but nonetheless, Honthorst is likely the most famous of the Utrecht Caravaggisti. He does some things that are definitely what we expect in terms of the way Utrecht Caravaggisti set themselves apart from Caravaggio's style. He usually uses an interior light source like we're seeing here. Also different from Caravaggio, he's using a repoussoir figure. He's using reverse tenebrism, that lighter background with the dark figures. We definitely can see these silvery kinds of tones and silvery lights that are being used here rather than those warm and earthy kind of palettes of Caravaggio. And like many Utrecht Caravaggisti, we're seeing a moralizing message here, that of memento mori and vanitas, right? Reminders of, choosing good behavior because you're going to have to face your final judgment because your death is impending at any moment. It's less dramatic, it's less viewer involving, although we do have some eye contact here. We definitely have a space for us at the table. We have figures that are close to the picture plane and cut off. So we are involved as viewers, but I think it's less so than some of the works by Caravaggio. Even so, there are other things that Honthorst is doing here that is similar to Caravaggio. The subject of musicians was one that Caravaggio also approached, though this one here is more moralizing. And in fact, the Utrecht Caravaggisti on the whole do more secular subjects more often than Caravaggio. We do have somewhat unidealized figures, but this one is done for the court in The Hague. So the figures are less earthy. They're dressed better than most figures within the Utrecht Caravaggisti representations would be. And that's really just a reflection of the source of the commission. There's foreshortening, there's attention to the naturalistic details and the textures and making those look incredibly convincing. And of course, that's something that is common in the North as well as something that Caravaggio did. And in our last example, again from Honthorst of the supper party, you can see how he's picking up on Caravaggesque elements, unidealized, naturalistic kinds of figures. We even have some that look reminiscent of those Bohemian types. They're half-length, they're cut-off figures. We get a lot of viewer involvement with the dramatic lighting, with the kind of vivacity of the scene, but also in how we feel so close to the action. So the figures are brought up close to the picture plane, and as we said, they're kind of cut off and half-length, and that makes us feel like we're really close to the action. We do have some things even foreshortened out into our space, which heightens that sense even further. We got the attention to naturalistic detail and texture. We do have tenebrism here, more of a traditional type of tenebrism, and that's very dramatic as well. One thing that he does, though, that's different than Caravaggio, we've got, again, the repoussoir figure. And this is a good example of how many of the Utrecht Caravaggisti, especially Honthorst, would use an interior light source rather than using that exterior raking light of Caravaggio's. We have messages of vanitas and memento mori. It's moralizing, it's didactic, it's meant to encourage people to make good choices and to be good Christians. And on the whole, I would say, even though we have some dramatic elements and we do have some viewer involvement, it's taken down a notch from what Caravaggio's works usually are. On the whole, then, when we look at these works from the Utrecht Caravaggisti, we can see how they have definitely transported a number of Caravaggio's key elements of style into the north. And it's through contact with these Utrecht Caravaggisti that many of the Dutch artists that are so well beloved today pick up on the more naturalistic approach to the Baroque.